actually, as a liberal, and I just have to tell you, 4 years ago I was standing in Washington, D.C. during the election night, and it was such a marvelous political feeling to be outside the White House, to see all these people gathering, and they were not waving the flags. They were united because they believed in certain values, and I felt that was a political memory for me the rest of my life. I went back to the United States during the Democratic Convention in September this year, and I had a great opportunity to listen to the President and to the former President and to a lot of other politicians. So I think we have a lot to learn from the Swedish perspective to be better when it comes to storytelling, to have stronger emotions, to dare us to have that in politics, and perhaps to be more specific in our messages. So I think for me as a liberal and as a feminist, it's a fantastic night.
Do you agree that storytelling is something that Swedish politicians should do better?
Yes. No, I mean it's always enormously inspiring listening when you get the chance to listen to American debate, and not least American speakers. There is an oral traditional speech making that is truly impressive. But you could argue also that this election year has been not the best of election years when it comes to telling a good narrative. We've heard a lot about the deficiencies of the candidates of the other parties, but not that much about the future, and not that many inspiring stories about the new project and the job that the winners are to do. So
yeah, 4 years ago, your newspaper endorsed John McCain.
Yeah.
You didn't endorse him. Why is that?
No, I was very happy with the endorsement of John McCain, but we also wrote after the election that we had an election with one victor and very many winners. It had been a very good campaign, constructive campaign, and the attitudes of the loser, both winner and loser after the 2008 election, were thoroughly impressive. I'm afraid I'm sad to say I haven't been as impressed by the 2012 campaign, and I've been saddened by the negativity of the campaign and the lack of as we talked about before, the lack of inspiring narratives about the future. So I thoroughly wish that I congratulate Barack Obama. Naturally, it's always inspiring to follow American democracy in practice. It's a great example for all of us. He should be congratulated after running an impressive campaign and after winning. But I'm not envious. It's unbelievable job now.
So, Mr. Ambassador, do you agree with the view here that it's been a campaign of negativity and not so much hope for change?
Well, let me reflect on what the two previous speakers were talking about. I agree very much with the optimism reflected in Minister Olsson's comments. And I think one of the best manifestations of that is the youth turnout. The question was in 2008, was the huge youth turnout, the huge youth mobilization, the engagement of youth, was that an exception, or was that going to become the norm? And what we've seen in 2012 is that youth remain very engaged, and that makes me optimistic by definition. That the young generation is taking leadership. I very much believe in this generation. I think it's a courageous young generation that takes on the challenges of our time and doesn't simply subcontract that to the older generations waiting for their moment. They're using things like Facebook to loosely organize, and I think that's great. With regard to what we've heard in 2012, let me say that it is very different from what I've seen here in Sweden. You know, I've been here in Sweden for 1 year, and that's long enough to see the consensus-building process of decision-making in Sweden, which is very impressive. And that's what makes this country special. We have a different approach in the United States. It's noisy. We argue a lot. It's loud. But that's how we make decisions. We are a debating society, and if you go back to the days of the founding fathers back in the 1700s, you see that the debate between the gentlemen farmers back then were just as noisy and aggressive. But through that competition of personalities And yes, it's aggressive. Yes, it's tough, no question. Through that competition of ideas, for us, comes the best result. This 2012 election was a hard-fought campaign. It was engaged, it was intensive. The debates themselves had a more prominent and clarified role. But I think from that, the American leaders who have been elected have very clarified messages from the voters regarding certain key decision questions that have to be addressed by the president-elect and by the Congress, and they will have to choose whether to act accordingly. If they don't, the voters will speak again.
So, social media definitely adds another layer to this debate in society. What was the impact of Facebook and other social media?
Yeah, well, this has been an incredibly exciting year in the realm of Facebook, in part because it allows for two kinds of debates to take place. You know, it's the direct debate that takes place between the candidate, the candidates and the people, and that's happening in an online platform. But one element that I think is even more interesting of the 2012 elections this year is the debate that's taking place between people on this platform, still in a form that's visible to your friends. And the power of people and the power of influence that comes with that, I think, is such a new science that we still don't know exactly how to measure this. If any of you took a look at the Pew Research survey that just came out this last Tuesday, 45% of young people who were surveyed said that they were directly influenced by one of their friends or family members on who they were going to vote for. Across any age group, 30% said that they had, received an endorsement on their news feeds from one of their friends or family members. And so the real power to understand, what does that mean? How are we influenced by our friends and our family on this new medium, especially amongst young voters who are very open to talking about politics in a medium like Facebook, is fascinating. That being said, our fastest growing demographic on Facebook is age 45 and above. So how, over time, are people in the next age brackets going to become more and more comfortable sharing what they're thinking about politically, where they're going with their political views? I think we're just beginning a social science that's going to be really exciting to track over the next few years.
So Anders, how much of this do you think is translatable to Swedish politics?
I definitely think we see an increase in the importance of social media when it comes to, the sheer number of hours people spend on Facebook makes it a very important arena when it comes to politics in general, election timing in particular, naturally. I think, though, that so far our experience is that both 2006 and 2010, the predictions were that social media would be immensely popular, and I don't think we've really seen it happen in Sweden so far. So on the increase, definitely, in absolute terms, not that much yet, let's say.
Well, and I think also it's important to connect to a strong message, because the social media, Twitter and Facebook were going around meeting your friends or so on. It's just tools, and you need to have a strong political message. You need to have the story behind. You need to have your statistics. You need to have your own kind of type of getting it out.
So I want to move on to the next 4 years and what your expectations are. How do you think the relationship between Europe and the US will be affected by the second Obama term?
Well, the United States is definitely the most important, I would say, partner for the European Union as a whole, and it's a very important partner for Sweden when it comes to both, pushing the human rights issues, freedom on the internet, trade issues, and one very tricky one that we have coming up now is, of course, the free trade agreement between the United States and the European Union. And I don't think that the United States might be the biggest problem. We might have European Union countries that are a bit more hasty in this matter. But also one other area that I think is very important is to enhance the relations as a whole. And I remember when I met Madeleine Albright in September this year, and I was listening to a discussion about U.S. foreign policy. You might have heard about U.S. grand strategy, the new strategy towards the rest of the world. And the European Union is not that present at all in this new strategy. And a friend of mine asked Madeleine Albright during this conversation, you have been discussing the American foreign policy now for 1 hour and 20 minutes, and you have not even mentioned European Union at all. And Madeleine Albright said, well, I can be frank with you, she said, because I'm European myself. And she said, get your act together, then we can become partners again. And I think that's also very often the message, that we need to have the same problems when it comes to unemployment, when it comes to getting on track again with our growth, and then we need to open up, deepen the cooperation more. But also, I think it's important to the very progressive agenda for the president that he launched when he was elected 4 years ago. So, of course, issues like climate issues, and he needs to deliver in this area. He needs to be a strong ally to the European Union, but also human rights issues, Guantanamo, and so on. So I think we can really work more in these areas.
So, Mr. Ambassador, do you think there will be progress on climate change and other issues that are sort of not working right now between Europe and the Earth?
Well, climate change made itself starkly and centrally known in the last 3 weeks of the campaign with Hurricane Sandy. And that was very much reflected upon by supporters, the candidates, and the candidates themselves. And so news developments like that will keep that center stage. But in terms of looking at the next 4 years on the key decision questions the president, re-elect in this case, will face in the next 60 to 90 days, I think the campaigns and the news show what they are. Jobs and the economy, taxes and the deficit. Key decisions pertaining to that. Overseas, military disengagement in Afghanistan. How to help address the economic crises elsewhere in the world, because clearly we live in a globally interdependent world, where while we in America are experiencing a modest recovery economically, that can be dragged back down by setbacks elsewhere. That's why we're so interested in focusing on what's happening in Europe. That's why Sweden we look at in many ways as a sensibly and responsibly run economy, with relevant lessons in some cases for elsewhere. But the way I would look at the approach to America in the next 4 years is to take a look at why the president was elected 4 years ago. I mean, President Obama was elected in 2008 to reshape America's role in the world. Remember, this is a person, Barack Obama, who in the year 2000 couldn't even get a floor pass at the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles. In 2004, took the convention by storm with his great speech, and in 2008 was the president-elect. He was elected for specific reasons, and that was to reshape America's role in the world, and certain principles inform the policies that have been implemented since that time, and those principles remain enduring. A certain approach to partnerships.
So, historically speaking, second-term president has been more foreign policy oriented. Do you think that will be the case this time around, or are the domestic problems too large to?
Well, the central issue of this election was jobs and the economy, but this doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a globally interdependent world when it's good for you if we're getting healthy and we're experiencing a modest recovery. It's bad for us if Europe is sick. And so that's the interdependence in which we live today. And that's why on domestic issues, there's a global context. And so I wouldn't just look at it as domestic or foreign. I would look at them as genuinely and inextricably intertwined.
So Anders, if you could give us some thoughts about how would you like not the new president, but Barack Obama to spend his first 60 or 90 days?
Oh, well, I think no matter what I would like or not, he will have to deal with Congress, and he will have to deal with a lame duck in Congress, where a House of Representatives full of angry Republicans. So it will be a very difficult period for the president from now till the New Year. And that will be his absolute focus, I'm sure. On the foreign policy scene, it will be interesting to see in what ways he'll react to what's happening in China this week and next week. don't think that Europe will be a major issue for the closest months. Europe will be a worry until we've got our act together, and that will take a while. But I think his focus will be elsewhere, mainly on domestic issues and on the international scenes. I think other parts of the world go first. East Asia, China and its relationship to Japan, not least, and the situation in the Persian Gulf, naturally.
So, Mr. Ambassador, do you think foreign policy will be a problem in Congress, or do you think the basic policy will be pretty much a bipartisan thing?
Well, I think that there will be a genuine effort towards bipartisanship in foreign policy, because to address imminent challenges, Afghanistan, Pakistan, nuclear security, counterterrorism, to reshape key geopolitical alliances, Russia, China, the challenges we face in the Middle East, requires working with Congress. Congress has, over history, never been as involved in foreign policy as it is now, through both resolutions to send messages to the executive branch on what to do, and in passing legislation that will constrict the latitude when it comes to this. I mean, historically, this is the high point, and that will continue. But I actually think that there were people running for public office in 2012 who were the least likely candidates to engage in bipartisanship, and they didn't win. And so, we'll see what happens, but I think that there is a huge interest on the part of the American people to see Washington work together, to not see these things as a zero-sum game. I will share a story that after I was sworn in as ambassador to Sweden, my wife and I went and we met with the Vice President of the United States, who is deeply interested in the American relationship with Sweden and sees it as an important partnership. And one of the first things he said to us was that when he came to Washington as a junior senator 30 years ago, he could sit down and have a beer with Republican counterparts who were on the ideologically antipodal end of the political spectrum of where he was, and they could agree on most things and disagree on some things. And today, that's unfortunately less the case, and he hopes that that will be more the case going forward, and I think that the American people do as well.
Yes, let's go back to the U.S. for a while. The women's issue became a pretty big part of this campaign, and in Missouri it looks like Todd Aiken lost the Senate election, which had pretty much wrapped up before his comments about women. Since that's sort of your domain, were you surprised to see this being such a big part of the election?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge one very positive thing from the elections. What we've seen so far is that we have all-time high number of women in Congress, and I think actually comparing sometimes the United States not with European countries, but with countries in the developing world, I mean, it's quite a low number of women on high-level political places. So that's something that I'm happy to change. But just going back, when George W. Bush was elected, the first thing he did when he took office was introducing the gag rule. And I'm not sure if you're quite aware about the gag rule, but actually putting a ban on financing reproductive health and rights on the global development aid level. And the first thing Barack Obama did when he took office was to launch the Fair Pay Act to fight discrimination when it comes to gender equality for women. So I think it's a very big shift in attitude between the Democrats and the Republicans in this area. And I think women as voters and dedicated feminists, and especially young people, really understood this during the campaign. And when I went to the Democratic Convention in September, I met a lot of, very well-known characters from the women's rights movement in the United States. And they said that they felt that this election took them back to the 1960s or to the 1970s, sometimes when they could, listen to some of the Republican candidates. So I think that's also show that people want a more modern society, and we need to fight for our rights, and we need to fight to keep them.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot to